We have one of those little things in our house too. Remember? This happens in this whole area. Okay, before we get started on actual history, I'm gonna get on my soapbox for a minute. Y'all have advising starting Monday, right? Do y'all know how to find your degree plan? Or do you just trust your advisor?
I trust.
You just search your major.
Say that again.
You just search on the degree plan, like your major and your
Yeah, okay, so you know how, but not everybody knows how. So it's pretty easy, but do you know what to do with your degree plan once you have it, or do you just trust your advisor to put you in the right classes? Please don't trust your advisor. So I'm going to show you real quick how to find your degree plan. So back in the dark ages, believe it or not, a couple of weeks before the semester started, they would print a big pamphlet in the newspaper, like the TV Guide times 10, or the Parade, or whatever it is that they print now. And on registration day, you walked in, so you looked through this thing before you started. It had all the classes that were listed, kind of like the class schedule. You walked in, they gave you an index card, 5x8 index card, with lines on it. And you had to walk to every professor that you wanted and get them to put a sticker for their class that said they accepted you into their class. And then you walk through this maze of hallways and rooms. This was all in the arts building. And paid your tuition, got your scholarship checks, paid your tuition. Then you took whatever you had left and you walked across to the bookstore and bought your books because that was the only option. But that's why. So this is the quickest way I can do it. All right, this is not the quickest way to find it. Degree programs. Will somebody tell me their degree? Nursing. All right. So down here you've got them by department. So the nursing. Those are the degrees you can get in nursing. You can get a bachelor's, a master's. So we're going to assume you're working on your bachelor's. Degree plans. These are all the courses you need. So what I would advise is you print this page off and take a highlighter or a pen and mark off what you've taken. And then look at the class schedule. So you go back to current students. You can go to the class schedule. You search by, so that will be the spring semester. So I know you had to take another biology class. Those are all the times available that you can, all the biology classes and the times that are available. Look at this before you go into your advisor. What I hear from a lot of students is, I have a horrible schedule. I have an 8 o'clock class and then I don't have another class until noon. Well, you could fill in those gaps if you plan ahead. look and see what's available to you. And then if that's not what they suggest, say, hey, would this work? Could I get in this class instead? Because you're adults and you're paying for this, or somebody is paying for you, but you're getting the benefit from it. Get the most you can get out of it. But don't just trust your advisors. And I'm not saying that they're bad people. Most of the advisors are good. Some of them don't. Or it's like, I have to do that, so I'll just get it done as quick as I can. Some of them are very, very good and very, very conscientious and look at you and, and ask you questions and want to get you the best schedule possible. But ultimately, it is your responsibility. So go in there with a plan before you just commit. And don't take their word for it. No, I'll wait till she comes back and then I'll shut the door. Okay, so that's my soapbox. I want y'all to be prepared. I better not do that. I'm going to turn off the live stream. But this degree plan is there for every, and yes, you have to take all these classes, but you've got 4 years or 5 to take them. And some of them are very specific. Like, these are supposed to be taken your senior year. So you can't take them earlier. Some are not so much. Anything that's got a 4 in front of it is supposedly a senior level class. My freshman daughter took a senior level class. In theater, they don't really care that much if you're, going out of order. Other departments care more. So that's where we're at with that. That is not where I wanted to be with that. All right. I may skip over some of this as we go. I think this is my full set of notes. I've only actually taught this class with PowerPoint twice. Y'all are the second time. So consider yourself the beneficiary of a friend of mine who thought it was horrible that I didn't have a PowerPoint. Most of the time I just lecture and you just take notes. So I think this is the full set. So we may kind of abbreviate some of it because I don't want to actually go through every battle that they have in the book. I will put a YouTube video on Blackboard that goes into much more detail about the battles if battles interest you. But I'm kind of more interested in the end result. So, independence has been declared. We've actually fought a few battles already, but now we're really ready to start the war. The British will end up committing 2/3 of her army and half of her navy to this battle or to this war. And they're committing across an ocean. Their supply lines are a little bit longer. And remember, this is an ocean, this is a supply line that doesn't have jets. We're talking months to get across the ocean, not simply hours or days. And Britain had other commitments. They have colonies elsewhere that they have to contend with. The Americans, on the other hand, had their own problems. We don't have an army, or we have the fledgling army. We have to create everything from scratch. We don't even really have a proper government at this point. We have the Continental Congress, which is just a group of representatives from all of the different colonies that are acting as a government. The militia, which is what we start with, have short enlistments. The armies lack discipline. Supplies are an issue. But we're going to go to war anyway. So in 1776, British troops land on Staten Island on July 2nd, the day we proposed independence, to begin the process of reclaiming America. Washington is going to take the troops he has from Boston to New York. He only has about 19,000 troops. They're poorly trained. They're certainly green. They haven't had much experience yet. Now, some of them did fight in the French and Indian Wars. So there are some, but not a lot. And he's coming up against arguably one of the strongest armies in the world at this point. Okay. They get there, they line up against Howe, who is the British commander, and they basically only get out with their lives because Howe had faced Bostonians, was a very cautious general, and there was a rainstorm. So with a little bit of luck, they managed to retreat. They lose Staten Island, but they escape with their lives. Washington figures out real quick he can't take the British on head on. He just doesn't have the men or the training to do that. The British hoped that change slides. The British had hoped to take New York. Now remember, New York's kind of in the middle. It was one of those middle colonies, and cut off the New England colonies from the southern colonies. Washington determines that he needs to defend New York. But again, he doesn't have a lot of men. Now, by the end of August, 9,000 more had joined. So he's up to 28,000. By December, that number is going to be 3,000. Short enlistments were the main reason. And when their enlistments ran out, the militiamen just went home. It's looking pretty bleak. Washington really can't defend New York, but it has to retreat back to Pennsylvania. And then Thomas Paine strikes again. Remember, Thomas Paine wrote wrote Common Sense. Now he's going to write The American Crisis. This is the one that says, I'm sorry, I should look this quote up. These are the times that try men's souls. It's that book. I'm not going to. Y'all can read the quote in the book. But it galvanizes the troops. It's very patriotic. Gets everybody hyped up. But Washington realizes his only chance is attrition. If he can wear the enemy down, if he can drag this war out long enough, the British will simply get tired and go away. That is his hope. And it's wintertime. in the 18th century, most armies don't fight in the winter. They go into winter quarters and just kind of hang out until the spring when it's better weather for fighting. Now, of course, that doesn't mean the war ends and everything goes back to normal. They're not going to have normal for a while. And war is not just the soldiers on the battlefield. War affects everybody in the society. And in the Americas, the effect was that everybody pretty much had to choose sides. It divided families and friends. You really, at this point, the beginning of the war, you had patriots who were for the war, Tories who were loyalists, who were loyal to the king, and some middle ground people. But those middle ground people are going to be pushed one way or the other pretty quickly. Once the war starts, there's really not a lot of wiggle room. You're either for or against. Benjamin Franklin obviously was a patriot. His son was a loyalist. Before the war is over, Benjamin Franklin's going to rewrite his will and write his son out of the will. Yeah, we had kids. There are probably still Franklin descendants today. Don't know any, but yeah, he had kids. I actually think he was probably, oh, I wish this wasn't recording, a dirty old man. But just kind of reading about him, he kind of strikes me as the kind that you might want to stay out of arm's reach. But it was pretty cool anyway. I mean, he did a lot of really amazing things. And yes, he had kids. There were brutalities that went along with this choosing sides. People were tarred and feathered for their opinions. People were run out of towns. Property was taken, particularly of the Loyalists. The Loyalists suffered a lot at the hands of the Patriots as far as losing property. Loyalists were really, they were numerous. There were about 100,000 of them, but that's really only about a third of the population. And the opinion was split in England as well. There were people in England who just said, cut them loose. Let them be their own country. We don't care. We don't need those colonies. We can still trade with them. And then there were others that backed the king and said, no, we've got to keep them. The English, however, thought there were a lot more loyalists in the colonies, particularly in the southern colonies. And like I said before, England was, if they had to lose part of the colonies, they were more willing to lose the middle and the New England colonies than the South. The South is where they were getting all of their really good raw materials. It's where the lumber was coming from. That's where the tobacco was coming from, the rice, the sugar. That was their market. People were buying things in the South. Not that they weren't buying things in the North, but in the North, you had more merchants who were also buying and selling. The North were the middlemen. So if they could just keep the colonies, they could cut those other people out. If they could keep the South, they could cut out all those middlemen and it would be better. And the Southern colonies had traditionally been more loyal to the king anyway. These were the Cavaliers. These were the ones who got their colonies because they had supported the king. This was where all the proprietary, well, the middle colonies were proprietary too, but a lot of the southern ones had been proprietary. They had been given to people who had supported the king. It's going to backfire on them because there were loyalists, but there weren't nearly as many as King George thought, and they weren't nearly as willing to take up arms, as King George thought. He thought, we'll roll in there with some redcoats and all these loyalists will start coming out from behind the trees and join our army. It didn't work that way. The militia and the army, they're different. So National Guard is probably the closest we have to a militia today. The militia were pretty much any man was in the militia. You were expected to take up arms to defend your community. If you join the army, that's a little bit different. It's kind of the difference between joining the National Guard, where you work 2 weekends a month and 2 weeks a year and you get paid. But if we go to war, they can call you up and send you away for months and months and months. If you join the army, it's like joining the army today. You belong to them 24/7. You live, eat, drink, army. You're in the army. You're going to march. You're going to drill. You're not going to go home and plow the fields because it's springtime and it's time to plow the fields. And there was cooperation between the two, but there was also a lot of conflict. The militia would augment the Continental Army at certain times. Washington said, and I will paraphrase because I didn't write down the quote again, they come, you don't know when or how. They leave, you don't know when. They use up your supplies, eat your provisions, and leave you at the most inopportune moment. That was his quote about the militia. But the militia saved the army on a lot of occasions during this Revolutionary War. They were mostly guerrilla fighters. They preferred ambush to traditional fighting. They're not the ones that are going to line up and shoot. How many of you have seen the movie Patriot? Okay, that's a pretty good description of the militia. We'll sit together in camp and drink, and then the next morning we'll go out and we'll ambush a bunch of British. They like to hide behind trees and shoot at people. It was a whole lot easier than standing out in the field and getting shot at. The army was better trained. They were more reliable. But both groups are citizen soldiers, and that's important. You're going to get paid, but it's a voluntary position. No one said, oh, you're 18, you're in the army now. You have no choice about it. You chose to be in the army. Finance and supply are going to plague the poor army and poor Washington. Because there is no real national government, there's no treasury. There's no infrastructure to, cut paychecks or order boots or order jackets or bullets. Each state was supposed to provide a certain amount of money to support the army and support the war effort and support this fledgling government. And remember, this government's doing other things too. We talked about that, how they started a postal route, how they're negotiating with the Indians. They're also negotiating with other foreign countries. We start real quick trying to keep to get France involved. But no state actually provides what they was due. The army will eventually start taking directly from farmers, giving them IOUs, that, maybe someday we can pay for that pig, but I'm sorry, we're starving. And that's going to affect, going back to the society thing, that affects society too. Because now that family is short a pig. That pig may have been what was going to keep them fed through the winter. And the approach of the Army, and we'll talk about this more later, also affects society. Washington instructed his men to give receipts, to write down, hey, this is what we're taking. We're going to have a record of it, so maybe someday you can get paid for it. The British Army just came in and took things. Well, I'm going to be, as a human, a whole lot more appreciative of the people who will, yeah, I'm still mad that you took my pig, but maybe you're going to pay me back someday. So I'm going to like you a lot better than I'm going to like the group that just comes in and takes my pigs and says, who cares? Starve. And that's going to sway a lot of people. It's going to sway a lot of those middle ground people. And it's going to change the mind of a lot of loyalists who will switch sides and go on to support the Patriots more than they do the loyalists or the crown. Now, the one thing that the states did that didn't endear them to the loyalists was seize their property and sell it and use the money to help pay for the army and run them out. They also will resort to printing paper money again. By 1777, we have a government arsenal established at Springfield, but most of the wartime munitions were captures of imports from France, or captures or imports from France, sorry. Either, they take a British ship or France actually gets one through. The other thing that Washington does, and this is very timely for us, right there at the beginning of the war, smallpox is an issue. An inoculation had been developed for smallpox in the 1770s. And Washington very quietly and quite secretly inoculated all of his troops. And a lot of civilians got inoculated as well. It wasn't as safe a vaccine as what we have today. About 2.5% of the people who received it died. But it's going to give Washington a great advantage, because if you get the smallpox vaccine and you survive it, you don't catch smallpox. And that's why we lost at Quebec, because everybody had smallpox and no one complained. It's the only time in our government that we've had a mandated vaccine that nobody complained. And, I know that's a big thing in the news right now, but it's not new. It's not new news. One of the things with COVID that has driven me nuts is, in these unprecedented times, no, everything has been precedented. We have had pandemics before. We have had mask mandates before. We have had overcrowded hospitals before. Not even that long ago, in 1918, when the Spanish flu came through, which is misnamed. It actually started in Kansas, but it started during wartime, and everybody kept it a secret, unlike COVID. Nobody's kept that a secret. And it finally got blamed on the Spanish, because the Spanish were the only ones talking about it, because they were the only ones at that point in the war that weren't really in the war. So everybody blamed the Spanish, but it's not unprecedented. So we have a mass inoculation, and we're ready to start back up in the spring. This slide is in here, but we're going to skip it. Y'all can use this as an outline when you read through the book, but I don't want to talk about all of that. Just let's go with 1777 was a, wait. Yes, we'll start with that. Setback for the British. The British plans to bisect the colonies by taking New York will come to a resounding defeat, or a resounding end with the defeat at Saratoga. And Washington will continue with his idea of attrition. Win one, lose one, retreat, but you don't lose everything. But the most important thing that's going to happen in 1777 is France is going to come to our side. And it's going to take from 1776 to 1778 before it truly gets formalized. But the French had started supporting the Americans in 1776 with supplies. They sent some 14 ships worth of supplies, mostly gunpowder. Spain sent some too, but most of the support is coming from France. When the British are defeated at Saratoga, Paris is excited as they are in Philadelphia. And they celebrate it almost as if it's a French victory. Now remember, the French hate the British. And the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Not only that, they just didn't really have anything against us at this point, but they really hate the British. You really can't overstate that. So by 1778, the British are actually ready to recognize the United States and offer up some treaties. There's two treaties that are agreed to. There's the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, which recognizes the United States and offers trade concessions. That is very important diplomatically. If you can get a recognized foreign nation to recognize you, then you might exist. If no one recognizes that you're a state, and I'm using state in the term of nation, then are you really a state? Are you just trying to be a state and you're not? But once people start recognizing you, it gives you validity. And the trade concessions also add to that validity. And they make it easier to trade. And as long as you have commerce, you have money coming in. So this is very important. And then we also sign the Treaty of Alliance, which states that if France enters the war, that both sides would fight until American independence was won. So that's important. If they enter the war, they have to stick it out to the end. We agree that neither would declare a truce without the agreement of the other. So France can't declare an end of the war for us. We can't declare an end of the war for France. And they agree going in to guarantee the other's possessions in America. And France agrees to not try to go after the things it lost in the French and Indian Wars. They're not going to go after Canada or any British holdings on the American mainland. The battle is just to get American independence. By June 1778, the British had fired on French ships which is considered an act of war. So the French and the British are at war. Now remember how I said the British have other commitments? Well, this is going to be one of them. The French have a real navy, one that can like sail far from its coast, unlike what we have, or the Americans have. So they can spread the fight out. And it's going to stretch that British Army and British Navy thinner. And it does stretch, I mean, it sounds funny, but it does stretch the British Army. When you watch these pirate movies, there's always redcoats on board the English ships. That's because English sailors were not fighters. They put Army or Marines on the ships to do the fighting. So little guys that run across, swing across onto the pirate ships, those aren't the British sailors. They're fighting men who just hang out on the British ship until it's time to fight. So that's going to kind of stretch the army because they're going to have to put people on these ships. So this French entry into the war becomes one of the most crucial factors in winning. If you play the what if game, and what if the French had not entered the war, had not recognized the U.S., you could come up with a completely different picture. Spain is going to enter in 1779, but they're entering as a French ally and not a U.S. ally, which is, a technicality, but it's an important technicality. When it comes time to negotiate the end of the war and who gets what. In 1780, because the British don't have enough going on, they're going to declare war on the Dutch, because the Dutch have continued to trade with the French and the Americans and just aggravated them. So they're, they don't have enough fighting to do. So now they're going to fight that. And the fighting is now, by 80, is going to spread through the Mediterranean, the West Indies, Africa, India, and the Americas, and at sea. So the British have really spread themselves thin, which helps with Washington's plan to win the war by attrition. So 1788, which I guess we're taking this by year, is how I organize this. Lord North is ready to give up. Remember, Lord North is the prime minister. He can see that they're losing, that it would be easier just to throw in the towel, but the king will not allow it. Not only will he not allow poor Lord North to make peace, he won't let him resign as prime minister either. He won't let him quit. On March 16th, 1778, the House of Commons grants all the demands that the Americans had made before the war. They repealed the Townshend Acts, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Prohibitory Act, and they send peace commissioners to the colonies to negotiate. The Continental Congress refuses to recognize them unless they recognize the United States as a nation, or they withdraw all of the troops from the American continent. Now they can't do that. And still, either one admits you've lost the war. If you pull out your troops, you've given up. If you recognize the United States as a country, you've lost. Now they're a country, they're no longer your colonies. So the peace commissioners are not received, and they withdraw from Philadelphia. And again, the British look to the south. And they hope that those loyalists there are going to support them. And it's getting winter. The winter of 77, 78 was a really rough one for the Army. Just so for perspective, the British, after Saratoga, had fallen back to Newport, Rhode Island. They've left Philadelphia, and they take winter quarters in Newport, in a nice little town with buildings, fireplaces, good things like that. The British troops are at Valley Forge, camping out in the open, and it was a cold winter. They suffer from hunger, disease, the cold. They lack shoes and blankets. Again, there's times people, cook the leather on their shoes just to have something to eat. Most of the horses are going to die from exposure or starvation. By February, there are 7,000 troops that are too ill from duty to do their duty. About 2,500 are going to die. Around 1,000 are going to desert, which you really can't blame them for that. Again, they resort to taking food from local farmers to get through the winter. But by spring, things are starting to look better. Because they're not actually fighting, because the British are in winter quarters, Washington takes the time to start training his troops. Now, Washington is probably the most well-trained soldier in the American Army, but he's not the most well-trained soldier in the world. He is a great leader, but he still lacks some military knowledge. But he gets some help. There's some foreigners that get involved. One is a German named Friedrich Wilhelm. He's the Baron von Steuben. And if you watch that little cartoon, he's played by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Great accent. The cartoon cleans it up a lot because apparently Baron von Steuben liked to use profanity to induce discipline and inspire his troops. He didn't speak English, he was German, so most of his commands were given through an interpreter. But he starts training the troops, teaching them how to march, teaching them how to shoot, teaching them how to be soldiers. They don't allow some of the brutality that had scared off the Americans when they saw the British during the French and Indian Wars, but they do instill discipline. Another foreigner who gets involved is Gilbert de Montier, the Marquis of Lafayette. He is a wealthy idealist. He is a soldier and a diplomat, and he comes to Washington asking to be allowed to help the army for free as long as they make him a general. He wants to be a general. So Washington makes him a general. He's kind of skeptical at first, but they actually become very good friends, and he becomes one of his most trusted aides. And so by the end of this Valley Forge period, they're starting to look like a professional army. They're starting to act like a professional army. And then to make things even better, Congress promises extra pay and bonuses to those who will stay in the army for the duration of the war. Now, that's going to come in part in land. took part in money, and how they plan to pay on this, I have no idea because they're broke. But it's a promise, and it's better than nothing. And then, of course, the alliance with France also raises morale because they think that they're going to have a lot more help. Okay, we're going to skip this next slide too, the frontier fighting. But like I said, it'll give you an outline when you read through the book. So when they come out of winter quarters, the fight turns to the south. Like I said, the British hoped that the Tories there would rise up in defense of the empire. They want to keep the area because it's an economically important area. And when they start, it seems like a good idea. They have some actual early successes. In November 1778, the British forces took Savannah. Then they head to Charleston. Unfortunately, along the way, they start plundering. And this is what I was telling you. They're so harsh and so rude that they turn a lot of people's minds. You know, people who would have supported them suddenly don't want to support them anymore. You know, that's not what they're in this for. The Americans send Horatio Gates, who was a hero of Saratoga, south to face the British generals of Clinton and Cornwallis. The problems are that the Loyalist strength is not what the British had hoped for. The plundering was brutal. And then they go a little bit too far. I don't know if you would call this politically, socially, but they start bragging that they're going to take the backcountry Patriot leaders. Sir Tarleton and another man named Patrick Ferguson were leading Tory militiamen. Now, remember we talked about how you have the Highland Scots and the Scotch Irish in this backcountry area? Well, they were a proud group. And these Tories threatened to come across the mountains and hang the Patriot leaders. So these guys are called over mountain men because they're over the mountain. They're on the other side. Decide, okay, you want us? We'll come to you. And the over mountain men went after Ferguson, caught him at Kings Mountain, North Carolina, decimated the British forces, and emboldened other militia type leaders in the area, such as Francis Marion, who's the Swamp Fox, and Thomas Sumter, the Carolina Gamecock. And these militias start pushing the British back. And it basically turns into guerrilla warfare between the Patriots and the Tories. The British Army itself pulls back. But these two militia groups just start fighting it out, and it gets very brutal in the backcountry. The British Army is going to hold up at Yorktown. So Yorktown is on the Virginia coastline. We'll start with Yorktown. I don't know how I can get through it in 3 minutes, so we'll start with Yorktown next time. Y'all have a great weekend.
Good. How are things with your group?